has come out to participate, to listen to these amazing people. And I really want to shout out Spectrum. I cannot tell you what they've gone through to make this happen. Tony Walt back here taking pictures of all of us, beautiful people, really worked his butt off to make this happen. You know, just big round of applause for Tony, please. So my name is Seth Bender. I help run Denver UX. Zoe Tran, the other two organizers, did not make it tonight. If you don't know, we do a monthly happy hour, usually the first Tuesday of the month. For the time being, it's that ratio. It's a great opportunity to come out, meet your fellow UXers, some design folks, and also just people in the community that want to get to know one another. Professionally, people who actually provided all the beverages and food is my company, Vincent Benjamin. We're one of the premier staffing agencies in Colorado. We actually have the pleasure and privilege of working with Spectrum to help build out their teams. And it's something that, you know, again, I'm just very grateful and appreciative for. So with that, I will let the speakers come up, the main attraction, and Devin, he will take it from here.
Seth, thank you. So as Seth mentioned, thank you so much to those guys. I did very, very little to set this up. I was basically just a fly wall called the sign. So Seth and Tony, once again, it's awesome. So just want to give a really quick introduction to what a design system is, just to make sure that anyone that might be here on accident can go ahead and walk out in 10 minutes. My name is Devin River. I am Senior Director at Charter, running our design systems team. It's actually a newly formed team. We've been around for like 6 or 7 months, so I'm actually in the process of learning a lot. So a lot of the questions I'm asking these guys is specifically so I can learn a little bit more. So hopefully everyone gets a little bit out of this as well too. So to start off, what's a design system? Right? It's basically just this kind of set of interconnected patterns, shared practices for building coherent products. And I'll get a little bit more about the parts in just a second here. But it includes UI building blocks, UX patterns, and voice and tone pretty importantly, so it feels like the products you're building are basically made by the same hand in the same company. Very, very common misconception with a design system is that it is a pattern library. That is not the case at all. A design system is quite a bit wider than that. A pattern library is actually just a small part of the design system. And I'll get into that in just a second as well. But ultimately, the pattern library is there to try to fix the repetitive elements that you use in all of your UI. So use the same button, use the same text, and all. So the kind of fundamental parts of a design system include purpose and values. So this is a really big one. This is the reason you're a company. This is the reason you're building a product. This is the entire reason that you're doing any design work in the first place. This includes researching your users, researching the general field that you're shooting for, and making sure that you're at least hitting the right target nodes that you need for your product out there. This is usually found through user testing, research, analytics, etc. The next big one is the design principles. So design principles are actually built off of a lot of the research you're doing in the first step to actually build out those purpose and values. This is sometimes written as a manifesto of sorts. So at Charter, we use something very similar to connect and entertain. And so those words tend to hold a lot of meaning as you're going through designing products. And in a lot of ways, this kind of gives you a framework as to how you're going to design your products. So if the product is not connected and entertaining with your users, then you might not be doing a great job. So it's time to start looking at that in a different way. Behaviors and functional habits. Now this is a big one. So this has a lot to do with your calls to action, the main point of view that you want users to move through the UI. So this, for Charter, in a lot of cases, is we do a lot of video work. So in a lot of cases, the goal is to get the user to the video as quick as possible. Right? You want them to actually be enjoying content, that's the main thing that the reason they want to do all the way out. And in a lot of ways, this is represented through documentation as to what a call to action does, what the main goal for the user is as you're actually moving through the UI. Aesthetics and conceptual patterns. This is actually your UI. So this is what you all think of as like Bootstrap or material design. It's not integrated with Google Docs specifically. But this is the documentation to organize all those elements. So this includes buttons, it includes text styles, it includes colors, and this is what ultimately kind of makes all of your UI consistent beyond the actual UX pattern, getting people into where they need to go. And then shared language. This is, again, a very important one. This is the tone of your product. This should really feel like it's coming from the same person. One person is speaking to you as you move through these products. A couple of the ones that we use at Charter, which are fairly specific, but these can be very broad as well. Something like, it's smart but not arrogant. That's the way you speak to your customer. Or you speak professionally, but you're not quite formal. All right, so you need to kind of hit the right area of how you talk to your users, which is pretty important to make sure that that is that single voice and tone as you're moving. So a couple references so that you guys can learn a little bit more about this. The first little spiel there, those 5 steps that I just gave you guys, is actually pulled directly from this book. This is the Design Systems book. This came out recently. It's sponsored by Smashing Magazine. The author is Alla Kolmatova. I think I got that right. The first half of it is just foundations. So it includes those 5 steps, how you move through those, a lot of detail into them, and how you can go about building your own products. The second part is the actual process. So how you build a team, how you get together and actually get this thing funded and continue to move forward. Another great book, this came out, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, is Atomic Design by Brad Frost. And a lot of you have probably heard about this, a lot of you guys have probably referenced this as you're building products, but it ultimately breaks down products into 5 different parts. Atoms being your kind of like smallest little piece, so this includes like colors, a lot of the building blocks to actually build things together, molecules, which are built out of atoms, and then organisms, which are built out of molecules, and then you build templates and you build pages and so on. But this is a very good way to actually get started in a design system and a very good methodology to start getting building. And then I want to show you guys just a couple of really quick examples as well of some design systems that are doing a job today. These are design systems that we reference often at Charter as we're going through and actually building ours. First one is Carbon. This is built by IBM. This is an incredible system. They had worked very hard to actually make this open source at IBM because, as you can imagine, sharing some of the ways that IBM works is probably a pretty tricky job for a company like IBM. But they do an incredible job of actually making all of their repos public, so you can go to their repositories in GitHub, you can actually see the way that they're writing code. They talk a lot about how they actually build their backlog, so they have a public backlog to see the things that they're currently building and what they're exposing to the public. Another huge one for us is Windows, so their design system is called Fluent. And these guys are very, very heavy on accessibility. They always have been, they do a great job with it. Windows is traditionally known as a pretty good accessibility product across the board, but they do a great job of talking about everyone when they do design. So it's very inclusive, it's very universal, and it's very powerful in the way that they actually talk about their users. And not to mention they also build a ton of hardware too. So they're integrating hardware and software together, which is great. Shopify Polaris is the third one here. And so Shopify is actually building their design system for third parties for the most part, which is very, very tricky when you start to talk about the voice and tone of other people's products. But their goal is to allow people to go through the shopping experience with confidence. So they tell you how to speak about the way that you're moving people through the UX process to actually get them to pay for something, which is key, right? You need to build that confidence when you're doing that. So their voice and tone is pretty incredible. So that's the end of my little spiel. We're actually going to jump into the talk here. And some of the topics that we're going to chat about is getting started. So like, how do you actually do this thing, right? And in a lot of ways, like, we've always done this. It's just now it's a little bit more formalized. There's a name to it. Another big one is value, leadership, and funding, right? So how do you actually pay for this? Like, how do you set aside the time? How do you put in the energy and allocate the time to actually get this built? Oh, sorry. And then effective teams. So this is actually building the team once you have your leadership and funding together. This is who you need on the team, you know, how that gets put together and what people actually do to get the work done. Implementation and upkeep, pretty straightforward, right? Like actually building the thing, upkeeping it, versioning, so on and so forth. And then measuring success, like how do you know you're doing a good job? Are you testing? Do you have user research? Moving on through that. So our panelists. So super excited to have these guys here. Actually know Chris Dura. We work together every day. Good dude for the most part. He works at Charter with me. He's a senior engineer on our prototyping team, so he's a very good bridge for us between the development side and the design side. So he should get a pretty good intro from that side, I would think. And then we have Patrick Hansen. So Patrick Hansen is working at a growing company right now. They had just gone through a couple of mergers. Couple? Does that sound right? Yeah. One big merger, okay. And so he's currently in the process of building this design system for them. So he'll be a good point of view from there. Rob Hunter is actually a VP at Healthgrades. So he's going to be able to give us a little bit of insight into the actual leadership, how funding works, how you actually convince people to build this thing. And then Ryan Spahn. So Ryan Spahn was a big part of the, what is it? Salesforce, yeah. So Salesforce was one of the first big design systems to actually be introduced to the public. And he was a big part of actually getting that built. And now he works at Google, actually implementing material design. So she had a good perspective on actually bringing that into the products that he's building and how you work with greater teams. So let's go ahead and get that going.
I'm surprised someone didn't cue up the Jeopardy music.
Yeah, very important. Cool. So to start off, why do you guys think the design systems are so hot right now? Like, there's a lot of people came to this, right? This has become this very, very popular thing in the world of design. Why do you think that is?
For me, from the development side, I think having a system in place allows developers to go a lot quicker. And when there's consistency from, especially when you have a big design team, there's several designers on any one product. As long as those designers are rowing in the same direction, a developer can create their own system and develop it, and it's going to go a lot quicker for them.
Check. I think there's come a little more formal realization of the importance of continuity and consistency and the continuous reinventing the wheel that has been happening. And I think that's both from design and development. And now it's, design systems have been around for a while. The phrase design system is more the hot thing right now. And they may have not been complete design systems in the past, but the parts, like a pattern library, UI kit, whatever you want to, those pieces have been there, and they solved the same problems back then as they are now. It's just becoming more formalized.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add on to that, I think that ever since the Industrial Revolution, I think that many industries have taken advantage of things like this to standardize their parts, to make their processes more efficient, ultimately to, for the bottom line, right? They're able to produce things faster, more consistently, and their customers come to expect that. And I think that especially with software right now, consumers have come to expect that a family of products look and act and feel like one.
I think for me it's two things. It's the cool kids are doing it. So Google's doing it, Salesforce is doing it. That gets people attention and gets it exciting. And then two, I think it raises having a design system raises the quality of the software interface. And that is something that is desirable by everybody, designers, engineers. Oh, it's less work for me to make things high quality, polished. I can make them more quickly. And that's very appealing to everybody.
That's great. So how then do you make the decision to actually start building a design system, right? So you guys both talked about, or a couple of you guys talked about, it was just never formalized before, right? Like design systems has always been this idea. But now that there's more formalization around it, there's a couple of rules around it or what have you, how do you actually make the decision from just building products to actually building a design system?
For me, our experience was we were trying to build products, and our designs were consistent. but every new development team had to rebuild the same UI component because there wasn't a system in place and they weren't sharing code. So trying to get that consistency, we started sitting down and trying to make like basic pattern libraries and reuse them and hopefully get the developers to like talk and say, this is the same thing. You don't have to re-implement it again just because there's a different designer or a different product.
Cool. So that's great. Does it make sense that you have to convince leadership, or is this something that you can kind of do grassroots style? Right? Do you need to go up to the top of whatever organization you're in to convince someone to actually spend funding on this, or is this something that just gets kind of like organically built?
I think that you can probably do both. In the example of Salesforce, we started the project, and it was mainly a style guide that was going to be used for UX. And we didn't ask permission to do it. We just started doing it because we felt like this was just, it was going to help our team move faster. And that naturally evolved into more ideas. We got an engineer on board who was like, I can automate this and I can generate all these, these values automatically in a nightly build. And we can build it all out in HTML and CSS. And like, I'm going to work on this, right? And it started to evolve into this system that made sense. And then we came at this point where a major redesign was sort of coming down from the top. Mark Benioff decided we're going to upgrade the entire interface and we're going to rewrite all of the components in Salesforce. Go. And it was at that moment that we took the work that we already did and we pitched, okay, what if we married this with the actual engineering team and their components? And that was when we got buy-in for it because we could speak to all the efficiencies that were going to happen because of it, both on the eng side and the design side. I mean, you cut out all that back and forth between the designers and the engineers. And once you establish the visual design system, there's also a huge reduction in like the art direction that needs to happen. And also all the one-off sort of like special snowflake stuff, especially if you have a sponsor at the top saying, this is what we're going with, starts to go away.
Yeah, and especially at Charter and Time Warner Cable before the merger, they weren't software companies, they were cable companies. So a lot of the software development and the design for that software was farmed out. So naturally you had a lot of inconsistencies based on whichever design advertising firm designed the product. So as the software development, as we were bringing it more in-house, we wanted to get those things actually looking like a family of product. And the natural step was to start with style, like a simple style guide, like Ryan said.
Was there any evangelism that needed to happen to actually spread that across the board? Like, did you have people going from meeting to meeting, like pitching this idea of this design system, like we need to have this, there's value here? Because I don't think it's always fully understood that it should be built to make us more efficient.
Yeah, I've been on several projects where, be it at agencies where they're smaller short-term projects or a product company, and as a designer, I think we all probably maybe know this or don't know this, but part of your job is also to sell as much as it is to come up with a creative solution to a problem. And part of that selling is backing up your idea, your concept, and if that means you have an idea that you want to develop a design system and you feel that it's going to help the teams, be it efficiency or whatever, you do need to propose that to whatever stakeholders are in your company. That might mean that you do have to come up with it more organically and informally and just start it out and then propose it once you have some artifacts and show them the value. Or it might mean you went straight to the top and got official approval. But ultimately, it boils down to, one of the biggest business goals is really, get it to market, right? Any tools or processes that can get your concept faster to market should be considered as a value add and a good investment.
I think for me, like the evangelism part, like there isn't a lot of selling to the teams of like, oh, this is a good idea. When people hear more consistent, move faster, you know, they can get behind it. I think when you get into actually going through and getting into the details, making the decisions, which technology should we use? Oh, if we decide on this design here, that means in my world over here, I have to use that design and I can't change it, or I have handcuffs now, I have some boundaries that I have to follow. And as an individual designer, that feels more restricting at first. That feels like there's some evangelism and selling that has to happen there.
That's a great point, actually. So how do you deal with that, right? So there tends to be this thing that happens with every other designer and the rest of the team that's not working on this system that says like, okay, well, now what do I do? Do I just take in these pieces and put them all together to build your design? Where does the design work continue for me then in that case if I'm not on the design systems team?
I would say that in my experience when we started the design systems team at Salesforce, there was a bit of a perception of an ivory tower team, even though they were sitting right with all the other designers in the same space. That sort of handcuffed effect of, you know, oh my God, all my creativity is gone. And so we definitely had to do some work in sort of defining what is that relationship between the systems team and the features designers, and how does that work. And ultimately, I think it would be great if everyone could contribute to the system and everyone's input is valued. I think that there's some differences that we might get to later between these two types of the communication channel has to be really healthy between these two groups. And I think that the part of the design systems team charter has to be that outreach to all the individual feature teams and those feature designers. And one of the things that we found really helpful in doing that is pairing up people on that centralized team with multiple feature teams. So they all sort of had a few that they owned, and they have weekly meetings with them to check in, see how they're doing, see what their ideas are. Maybe they have an idea on a component that doesn't currently fit into the system, or it's an extension of a component that we currently have that just needs to be tweaked for their certain scenario. And you know, hearing that feedback, making them feel involved, I think, you know, that buy-in really helps sort of ease that pain.
Yeah, and I think it's a little different, like when you're trying to, similar to you guys, we're relatively, this is a new initiative for us at Healthgrades. And when we're trying to establish some of this stuff, it's different pains than something's already established and we're just following that or adding to it. For us, it's like there's very little in the system right now. And so we don't want to slow people down who are on product development teams from delivering value to customers. So for us, I think it's been a pain, and we want to get better at the process of when do I create something bespoke, and when do I create something for the system? What leads to that decision? Like, is this something that's only going to be used in one place? Is this something that other people would find useful? Is this something that's part of a global UI? And that's been a challenge too.
Yeah. So how do you make that decision then, right? Like, you could potentially say that, yeah, we'll use that twice, or we might use that 3 times even, like, this should be in the system. So, yeah. Like, when do you start to pull back and say, no, we need to use these things that already exist?
Yeah, and I think for us on development side, it's been, does this thing already exist? If so, can I use it? If no, should I go through the process of getting it designed and approved and built and prototyped and put into the system before I can use it? Well, I have this product feature that will fix a problem on the site or deliver value to our users, and we're ready to work on it now, and I can design this thing and get it out there in a week if I just do it myself. And so I think there it's the having a process. Yes, you can do that. That makes sense. Get the value to the customer, and then after you've shipped that thing, let's bring it back to the design process, get it reviewed. We might have to refactor it for the system. We might have to compare these two components and do some resolution there.
So it's not a roadblock, basically.
It shouldn't be from
Right.
our perspective.
So do you guys ever see that happen where creating something for the design system or putting in that extra work actually becomes a roadblock, or does it always like kind of flow through naturally?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily a roadblocker, but it definitely makes you have to stop and think and consider some things. And although it could pause work, what it actually does is it helps grow and evolve this design system to improve. As you come up with problems where things don't live or do not exist yet to solve those, it just makes you think, okay, maybe there was something lacking there, right? So, I think that's another thing to consider with design systems, especially with software. Hardware might be a little bit different, but it's digital, it's living. You can always change it and evolve it very easily. It's pixels and code, essentially. So, you're not stuck in just this concrete structure or system. If it requires evolving, changing for the better, then do it. That's what we do with our designs too, right? We come up with some concepts, maybe put them out there for some usability testing, validate it. If it was working, we'll keep it. If it's not, we'll change it. And I think that applies to a design system as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tension there, especially when a design system didn't exist before, and also when you're trying to retrofit products. That can create a lot of conversations about, well, this new design system widget doesn't do what the old one did. And so how do you handle that? So there's a lot of tension there between those problems.
I want to get into that a little bit too, actually, because this is like a major pain point for us is retrofitting old products. So you have inconsistent products. You've kind of ID'd this need to have this design system so you have consistency across the board. But how do you bring all of those disparate products together under the same umbrella? And I think there's a couple of different ways to go about it, right? And they both have their advantages and their fallbacks.
Our current situation is kind of interesting. We're mainly working on one product, which is the website. But the way we built it and the way we work on it is like it's 8 different products. And so each part of the website has gone off and done their own thing. Very, very great for optimizing for delivery, right? You're constantly releasing features, you're constantly making improvements, you're going deep on a specific job that the consumer is trying to do or a specific piece of functionality. The downside is we come to make those things consistent, when you're very siloed on your sort of mission, your world, things become inconsistent. And when it comes to, okay, now we have identified this problem due to user testing or our metrics or our exit rate or whatever it is, when we want to bring those things to be consistent, to do that is either going to lead to a Frankenstein or it's going to take 6 months or 9 months to design and roll out across a large site, which we can't afford problems to come. The good news for us is it's already a Frankenstein. So it's already 8 separate apps. It already has inconsistencies. So that makes it a little bit easier for us from a decisioning standpoint to decide sort of which path to go.
Yeah, I was just going to echo the last bit about Frankenstein. So.
Well, yeah, so there's the 2 schools of thought, right? There's the Frankenstein idea. You go through and you kind of like switch one feature at a time as you go through, and then all of a sudden one feature is, well, 2 features become consistent, 3 become consistent, and your app or your website or whatever it is, your product is all over the place. The other way, right, is to kind of hold off for a little bit. You don't work on that new feature work. You actually kind of build everything in the background on a new branch or whatever and get ready to merge that in as all one big move. So can you talk a little bit about the differences between those 2 schools of thought, like what makes sense depending on the size of the product, size of the company, what have you?
Well, it makes sense to freeze feature work and just reskin the thing. But yeah, that's not going to happen with all the product owners I've ever met. So I haven't encountered a very successful guide to kind of get that done. So I always end up with Frankensteins at certain levels.
I mean, I think there might be a way to do, I mean, it depends on the ROI, right? I think you have to evaluate, especially with larger companies that have a big portfolio of, you know, acquisition companies, and they're all built on different code bases. Some of them more fragile than others. Some of them can be easily updated. Some of them are just smaller products and could probably be overhauled pretty quickly. If there's a decision sort of from the top down that, okay, we need to make all of these consistent, I think you need to look across those and individually decide how you're going to do that. And in some cases, it may be that you're maintaining two code bases and rewriting in the background, and you're going to come up with a big reveal of a new website. And then I think in other cases, it may make sense to just simply reskin it and make it look the same. Use all that same CSS that you're using everywhere else, but don't actually replace the components and guts underneath.
I say that I agree with that in terms of, it depends on which problem you're trying to solve, right? Like for us, one of the big problems we tried to solve really early in thinking about this was the company had rebranded about a year in advance, and a lot of the product hadn't reflected that brand identity of that brand visual language. They'd swapped out logos in a lot of places. You know, we'd thrown in some of the imagery, but our problem was our product wasn't reflective of the brand, and our product was inconsistent. To the point about you can address some of those problems without spending 9 months building a design system. Get the designers on the same page with the same UI kit, or at least get everything sort of audited, inventoried, understand what's there. You can change some of the very visible stuff. So for us, that was like our brand fonts, and our typography was all over the place. Like our buttons were all over the place. If you tackle those two things, that's a huge portion of what's visible to the people who are sort of being loud. And that helped a lot buy time to do a lot of the setting out our principles and thinking deeply about how can we actually bring these things together.
So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. I'm really interested to understand how your teams are structured. So who's necessary on this team to actually make this a success? Does it extend pretty deep into the development process, or is it just kind of like Chris, again, is our prototyper, so he's like the bridge between the design team in a lot of cases, or should you have these kind of full-time devs on the team as well?
I think you absolutely should. But resources can be thin unless you're a big monolith sometimes. Yeah, I think a design systems team, as much as possible, needs to be quote-unquote skills complete to get kind of the best velocity out of it and catch all the cases.
So does that include like a scrum master, product owner, so on and so forth? Like, is there
I think we're learning it includes a scrum master. Yeah. We've been trying for 6 months without one. It's not going great.
So that's true with everyone. You guys feel like you basically need like a full team to actually organize a backlog and be able to move through that thing efficiently.
Yeah, I think that'd be awesome. I like that idea. A lot of people won't be able to do that. So for us, like right now, it's only really one person full-time. We had 2 people full-time. We have 1 person full-time. We have an engineering team of about 7 people that includes QA, product owner, et cetera. They're part-time, and that's sort of what we have right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that it really depends on the size of the team that you can fund and put together. I think ideally you do have all the sort of key players in there, right? Like having a creative director, having interaction design, representation, visual design, writing, motion design, etc. And then having those eng partners as well, right? People who are very skilled at CSS and markup specifically. And then also those folks that are good at building the automation systems that will create your site and, you know, run nightly builds and, you know, produce all the static assets, right? I think it'd be great to have all those people on a team like that, but obviously you need a lot of funding to be able to do something like that. You know, and like at Google right now, we're trying to figure that out, and especially it's a scale thing because Google's so massive, right? And we have material design way at the top, right? And they're trying to cover every single product at Google. And we're just one small portion of that, right? We are part of a bigger community of apps, which is G Suite. And so what we've done now is we're forming a team that's sort of at a kind of an intermediary layer that's looking horizontally across a smaller set of apps to try and manage it at a smaller scale, and are building out that sort of intermediary design team.
So on that team, or that intermediary team, is there sign-off there? Like, are you asking them for specific yeses and nos to things? Are they giving you resources, or are they working with you to actually solve problems on the feature set?
It's a collaborative process back and forth. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I think that designers look to individuals on that team or other sort of delegates that are working very closely with the material design team for decisions around that. But, you know, Google has, I would say it's, externally I've heard it quoted as simply just a federated model, which is that, you know, there's all these individual designers and they're all contributing and everybody has to sort of design by consensus. And I would say that that's partially true. I think that there is a centralized model at the top and there are delegates that live on all these individual teams, and then there are these smaller sort of orbiting horizontal design system teams that are focused on a smaller amount of apps, and collectively everyone is making decisions and is very close to the system. So if I'm a interaction designer and I'm not super close to all the rules and regulations around visual design, I can go to one of those people for help. And that is part of the process of design. Just like you would get, you know, A11Y sign off on something, right? You want to get your visual design sign off, your writing design sign off, etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. I'm actually curious about the accessibility side of things too. How is accessibility integrated into these systems? Or should it be? Should it be feature by feature? Should it be embedded in the code? Should it be embedded in the design system itself? Or is it, you know, you're taking it piece by piece?
Definitely. I could talk for hours. Definitely should be part of the system. For us, the farthest it's gotten is the most important stuff around color contrast and making sure the decisions we're making that are systematic make sense. On the markup side, it's relatively new for us. We spent a lot of time on SEO. It's new for us to spend a lot of time sort of on accessibility. On our so we have healthgrades.com, we also have a CRM suite of products. And on that side, it's a little bit more important in terms of being part of the healthcare industry and being regulated, et cetera. But yeah, it definitely should be baked in. It saves money, right? If you have that built into the design system, then you don't have to have accessibility experts on every single team that's building code for the UI. Should front-end developers and designers be familiar with accessibility best practices? Yes. The reality is not all of them are. So instead of doing it inconsistently or you know, not the same way, it definitely saves a lot of time and effort to try to build that into the system.
Yeah, the easiest way to get buy-in for that is to get sued.
Yes. So
one hint is if you're looking at designing something, if you want some free accessibility advice, just post on Twitter, hey, I made an accessible website. You'll get tons of people auditing your website for you. Yeah, from the design side, I feel like the design system can, because designers are getting more used to knowing about accessibility, but much like devs, a lot do not have a ton of experience. So having a design system that kind of takes care of the details of that, where they don't have to think too hard, and they don't have to keep checking to make sure the contrast is right because they're just using the components that are there. I think that obviously helps.
Yeah, and I think that there's things you can do with the design system too to automate that kind of thing, right? So I know various design systems do this in different ways, but I know that maybe in Brad Frost's world, like the subatomic particles of the design system, which are sort of like the design variables,
Tachyons.
those, yeah, specific chunks of CSS that get reused everywhere. Colors specifically, you can programmatically run through those and look at the color contrast ratios between both type and icons against those colors, and then spit out at the end any errors that are there, and then automatically fix those.
Axe Coconut. Look it up.
Good luck. Never heard of it. So I want to talk a little bit also about different platforms. So we actually chatted a little bit earlier, and platforms means, I think, a different thing to everyone. I'm specifically interested in the differences between iOS, Android, web, etc. We work on TV as well at Charter, but when do you adhere more to what's expected by the user on that platform, and when do you sway a little bit into your brand, your marketing, your voice and tone outside of that platform?
When we say platform, it's usually web, iOS native, Android native. For me, I feel very strongly that whatever you're designing, the experience you're designing should not feel foreign to the platform that you're on. So I think a lot of the things like color and voice and tone make total sense to bring your brand in there. Creating unique interactions and some cool animation for something that people are used to interacting a certain way on the platform doesn't make a ton of sense to me. But.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So, Rob, I think I'm more interested in this from your point of view, but how do you actually go about building this team, right? Like, how do you get these people together and actually build this team?
So you go to your boss, who is a true believer, has a discrete budget, P&L that's not touched by anybody. You ask for $2 million, and they give it to you.
Easy.
Yep, done. No, I think you focus on the. First of all, don't ask for a team of maybe you can, but don't ask for a team of 12 people for a year, 2 years right off the bat. I think starting with a grassroots effort, showing value, focusing on the problems that the organization is feeling. So if it's inconsistencies, talk about inconsistencies. What does that actually mean? What does it mean in man hours? What does it mean in dollars? So luckily, if you're a shop that takes a lot of care into defining what you're working on, who's working on it, how many story points, how many hours are they spending on it, what kind of work are they doing, it's a little bit easier to sort of audit that stuff and say, well, this team built a calendar widget, and this team built a calendar widget, and this team built a calendar widget, and I'm adding up all these points, and I'm adding up all these points, and I'm adding up all these hours, and it equals this many dollars. That is a small piece of redundant work, and that leads to inconsistency. So actually pulling real numbers and talking about the value proposition can get you pretty far. Doing it at the right time also helps. So in terms of asking for money or asking for resources, keep your ears up for the right time to do that. If a lot of users are complaining about, well, I can't figure out how to do the thing that I do over here, and it works fine over here, and then over here it's different, jump onto the train. If there's problems, if there's people griping about inconsistencies, that's a good opportunity to start building that case.
That's great. I'd love to talk about some of those mistakes that have been made throughout building these systems. Like, what's been the hardest part? Like, what are some things that I can hopefully glean on what to skip as we're going through and building this? Like, what's a common gotcha, for example, or even deeper than that?
How much time do we have? Oh, man. not enough process, too much process. Getting hung up on very specific technical decisions. Getting hung up, like there's a million, so
I think one that comes across often is kind of lack of context of implementation. Sometimes, you know, even if you're just building like a UI kit, you'll realize problems with just that. They look good standalone, all these buttons, these headings, the typography, the colors, they look good when they're on this little kit. Once you start implementing them into a form, this view, that template, that page, whatever, then you're going to realize that sounded good, looked good on paper, but now, you know, that didn't actually work out. We need to make a variation of it. So as people build the design system, if it's a team, it's an individual, you need to always be aware of context of where this is actually getting implemented. And even if you're just designing form elements, some text inputs, select drop downs, go ahead and build a mock form and kind of see how it plays together. You don't want to build all this stuff and then find out when you put it together, it doesn't work. And
just because it sort of makes me think of like when you talked about the things that you should be doing leading into a design system. I think a big mistake is people jump right into, and I've done this many times, and we definitely have done this. You jump into the atoms, right? You jump into the molecules because it's the stuff that you can audit, it's the stuff that you get excited about, but you're doing so before talking about the principles, before talking about what your problems are, before talking about the context or where this thing is going to live or what it's actually trying to solve, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say that in my experience, I think that our biggest mistake with the Lightning design system was probably also the best mistake too, because we learned from it. Like I said, it was a grassroots effort. It was mainly around design. But we thought our ultimate goal with it in the beginning was to, one, just drive consistency, which was fine and that worked. But the other was to get designers to start designing in the browser instead of in Photoshop. And that didn't actually work at all. And we wanted to sort of build a prototyping platform off of it, and I think it was a good idea. But I think that had we done a little bit more research and talked to more stakeholders, done more interviews, really understand the pain points between design and engineering, and then also our third parties that wanted to integrate custom software into the platform, we could have got to the solution that we ended up at, I think, a lot faster. And I think we skipped that whole upfront research part and just started building stuff.
This is my first time through, so we're still making all the mistakes.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So we'll be back next year to tell you guys all our mistakes.
I'd say add one more thing. Although it's called a design system, and a lot of it is design, include development. That is a big, crucial part of it to make sure that your design system is actually technically feasible and you can implement it.
So let's talk a little bit about specificity as well. How specific do you get into your atoms, molecules, organisms, or however you bucket those items? Because there's a lot of great documentation if you go to something like Bootstrap. It's how to use a button, how to use these things, but it's not the design system, it's not branded, it has nothing to do with your product specifically. But if you're too specific, then it's very hard to build a feature. So where's that line? How deep do you go?
I kind of always have this in the back of my mind with any design thing task I do, be it actually executing a design or building a design system or an element in a system, and it really boils down to scalability. And you never really know what's going to come at you, what the design is going to have to support. You can have a good idea, make some assumptions, but there's so many different variables that could come in that could impact your design or to the point where it destroys it. So if you don't consider, like maybe today you don't need to support localization. English, bought a bunch of short words, cool. And then who knows, you might get acquired, might have a merger, and now you're in Germany. and you have to support German language. Does your design support that? Do the components and the philosophies in your design system support that? Even those aspects of not just language, but even culture. So as you build things or come up with parts of the design system, just be aware that you don't have total control over everything and you need to let it go. And it's okay to allow your concept to expand even into the unknown.
Yeah, I kind of feel like the biggest wins are for like the very basic, elements like the atomic stuff. So even if you go deeper in the components that you're designing, it's kind of a diminishing return in some cases when they get that specific. It doesn't mean you shouldn't design them, but I think you get a lot more out of those basic components because though you won't have to change those for years, regardless of what designs are coming out of product.
I think some of the attributes that I appreciate in the documentation around components specifically is, what's the rationale for this? Where is it used? Sort of mapping it to where it might be used in the system, providing some visual examples of that, and then also what I really like are do's and don'ts. Like, here's a great example of this, and here's how we would not recommend using it. And then also, again, reinforcing those with visuals is nice because people don't really read.
True. How do you guys deal with conversations around, and this is a lot of reason that people become designers in the first place and become like quote unquote good designers, the conversations around I don't like it or I do like it, and how that relates to the design system, because a lot of times it's not always your personal preference per se, but how do you do what's best for the design system in the company and get those conversations finished up?
I think there's two kinds of I don't like it, right? There's I don't like the color you guys chose, and this actually doesn't work for what a real world problem I'm trying to solve. Being on the dev side, I just hear those conversations. I'm lucky enough not to participate in them.
I'd say that, I don't like it needs to be backed up with rationale, sort of regardless if it's coming from, the CEO or, your desk mate. And that rationale is what matters, right? And one of the things that I find helpful, especially about design system, is laying out those principles. And I think there's different levels of principles, right? There can be the manifesto, but then there's also principles that help you make design decisions. And at Salesforce, we came up with a rule, basically that, and a prioritized set of those. And looking at clarity as number one, efficiency as number two, consistency below that, and then beauty as number four, and those were all stacked ranked. And so we agreed on that from the UX perspective. We got Eng bought in on that, we got PM bought in on that, we got execs bought in on that sort of stack ranked way of looking at things. And then when we had conversations, we could structure them around those. Is it clear? No, but it's beautiful. Okay, we need to make it more clear. It just helps structure the conversation. You can build that into the foundation of the design system.
I think the other thing is always have a escape hatch, right? Like, you don't like the thing, so what do I do now? How do I change the thing? To your point about having data to back it up, I don't like the thing is different from the people we're building products for don't like the thing. Right. People can't read your pink buttons. Okay, how do I change the pink button? We agree it's a problem, you have data to back it. How do we change the thing? What's the process for changing the thing? If I change the thing here, how do I get that into the system? Or how do I get that to the other apps, et cetera?
So let's keep going on that, right? How do you contribute, right? Like, you've made a good point, you've moved through that process, we've all decided that, yeah, that thing needs to be changed or that thing needs to be built. How does that work with the greater team contributing or the CEO giving feedback or anyone along that line?
You send a carrier pigeon to the ivory tower and with a note that you would like to change the thing. That doesn't work. I think, development teams have figured this out for a long time in terms of a contributor model, right? I think giving some framework for how do you make a change is really important. Making people feel like it's co-owned. It's not, it's not a thing that the guy in the corner, the girl upstairs, figures out the problem, solves it, and then gives it to you. So I think have some framework for feedback, have some framework for sign off or input or change, and then make sure people see that, right? So the feedback on the feedback. Make sure that, if somebody gives valuable feedback that is real and meaningful and actionable, show that it actually gets changed. I think that goes a lot to the credibility of the system and the people working on it too.
Yeah, I just want to echo basically the transparency of like the decisions that are made, because a lot of times I think what's missing when people say, I don't like the thing or this thing is bad, they might not have the context of the months of meetings that you had about this thing. Maybe they weren't with a company, they weren't, part of that group. So transparency in the decisions and making sure people do feel like they have a say, or they're at least heard, even if nothing ultimately comes of that feedback.
Yeah, I think just to echo the team collaboration, when you're working with others and you reveal a problem, if it's only one person revealing the problem, then it's probably their problem. If they're revealing a problem that other people are also considering is a problem, then that exposes that, yeah, there might be something beyond something subjective here. It's more objective. And also, I think, there's a problem with the design system, and then there's the problem the design system is trying to intend to solve. And identifying that, is this really a problem we even need to deal with right now? Or is it going to benefit the problem that we're actually trying to work towards?
How do you deal with versioning? So is there always the latest and greatest that people are picking up and using, or are you pushing out versions into that latest and greatest that could potentially break products? Are people on specific versions as they move through it? How do you release versions?
Is the developer going to talk now? Okay. Yeah, so I'm more curious about what y'all have to say about the design guidelines part of it, but as far as component libraries, we're going to attempt to try and match it up with kind of the revs and the iteration that the designers are doing. But developers are obviously very into versioning, and we need it. So it's a must-have for the components. But on the design side, especially when a design system is inherently living and breathing thing that morphs over time, I'm not really sure how.
We teach all the designers Git, and we delete all the sketch files. We export the React components to Photoshop. No. We copy the file, put v8-rob, and share it on Slack.
_ final. Yeah.
Final, yeah. No, we have not solved this. Yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, I was going to ask how you manage when a design comes to fruition and it's agreed to by product and someone's going to go and build that thing. It could be months down the road before they actually start developing. What happens when you discover a problem in the design before development starts? But they've already agreed to build this thing and it's shifted slightly. And so that's my question to the rest of the panel.
And I think it also depends on is your design system mainly an internal design system, or is it both internal and external? And I think that especially with the external communications, it's critically important that if there's anything that's changing that's going to break your code, there has to be a very proactive communication with your customers, especially if they're paying customers. I think that the external design systems do a pretty good job of that. I think material design updates once a month. They have a change log of all the changes. Some of them are just bug fixes that will just work retroactively, and there's no issue with it. And then there's larger changes that need to be communicated to customers. And I know with Salesforce's design system, because third parties utilize it, they support basically three different versions of it. One past version, the current version, and then if you subscribe to the latest and greatest version, which is like the nightly builds, they sort of concurrently support all three of those, but no further back than that.
Yeah, on the design side, like it is getting, like we feel the same pain, like a QA engineer looks at, you know, the Jira ticket. For us, it's not 6 months, but it might be 3 weeks. And the Jira ticket has a link to an InVision project. They go to the InVision project and they say the thing that was built doesn't match the InVision project. It's like, well, yeah, we fixed the thing, so now it's better, but the ticket says this and the acceptance criteria say this. It feel the same problem. The good news is like the tools are getting better, right? Like, you know, in terms of versioning the actual component library, there's a lot more things available in terms of making that easier. And then in terms of building the shared understanding with, at least with the smaller team, it's a little bit easier of doing some teaching, right? Like explaining to the engineers on your team and the QA engineers on the team that the design is going to change. We're not going to create 6 PDFs of mock-ups with red lines and specific pixels. We're going to iterate on the design as we work on it. And it's going to change a little bit. And try to focus the acceptance criteria less on the visual and more on the behavior and more on the interaction. On the visual side, you know, having tools like Zeppelin, having tools like Figma help in terms of answering what font size should this be if I'm building a bespoke thing, or which, one of the biggest things the design library has helped us with is the shared language, like which color name, which variable name should this be? Which, you know, headline name should this be? So there's a lot less of the what pixel size should this be, or which version of the design system should it be using.
So going back to the visual, how are we on time? I want to rabbit hole in just a minute. And Ryan, you mentioned about breaking code. That's very obvious in software development. Like it stops working. It's a breaking change. What is a breaking change in a design system from the visual aspect? How do you communicate, like a button changing from blue to red? That's a pretty obvious big change.
Right.
But it's obviously also very subjective and kind of fuzzy definition. Is a border radius changing 2 pixels breaking? Mm-hmm. It's not going to break the code, but it's definitely not going to look the same for someone who's paying
right, and I think that
attention.
can be the problem. Like if you're deprecating a certain CSS class that provides a certain layout, and the alternative is something different that requires you to adjust things, that's when you need to look at it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just curious how you handle defining
Yeah.
how much visually a component changes, and when it needs to be surfaced to like, hey, we should probably version this component, even though we haven't really figured out how to do that yet.
Can I just add one more thing here? I think one other thing, so on the internal design side, I think you're right. Like this is a living system that's always changing, and changes can be pretty frequent. Not the changes that are getting pushed out externally in public releases, but that like day-to-day churn of things. Like we're updating this icon, and you know the fill doesn't work on this, so we're moving it. You know, there's like just all these constant changes, and I think that there's some ways to manage that within the team. So like weekly check-ins with the design systems team are great things where you can both bring your work to them, but they can also bring changes to you that you need to know about. And then also, you know, setting up chat channels where designers can subscribe to them, and then they can understand when there's something that's meaningful that can be pushed out to all the designers, then they know about that.
That's great. Actually, just want to touch on one last thing as well, which is a pretty big thing because I don't think we've quite gotten there at Charter yet, which is measuring success. Like, how do you know that your design system is doing a good job? It's hitting all the right marks, and I think that's just beyond the idea of getting it implemented, right? So implementation, I think, is successful, but beyond that, how do you continue to iterate and make it more successful?
I think you have to set goals, and they have to be related to the problems you were trying to solve with the design system. I think a lot of that is hard for designers to think about because we like to think about stuff that's visual or the problem of the user. Tying a metric to that or setting an OKR to that is a little foreign. I think focusing on what problem you're trying to solve, if your team is creating, or your teams are creating inconsistent things, or if they're struggling because people who hate working on front-end work are struggling to create the thing that the designer created, like, can you measure that? Can you measure what the satisfaction of working on UI stories is like? How happy are your engineers when implementing the design? How fast are you able to go from solved problem or validated design idea to delivering that to a user? Can you measure that? How many releases does it take you to do that? How many days? How many hours? I think trying to identify those things. Can you measure duplicate code? Can you measure redundant components? Starting to pull those things, people will take you more seriously. If you have something tangible, if you have metrics that you can look at regularly and say, our satisfaction is going up, our bug rate is going down, our UI defect rate is going down. That's stuff that everybody can see and you can put on a dashboard and people can be buy into.
Like you said, we haven't gotten their charter yet, so I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know, it can be kind of tough to do this, but you know, if you're able to measure, and I don't know if there was metrics in place before this, but like, what would it take to change out this whole section of the website post-design system, or I'm sorry, pre-design system, and then what kind of timing would it take to change it out post-design system once it's already implemented, and you can actually measure that, of course. And then looking at those too, because of all the efficiency gains that you get with that, right? Which I think is kind of what you were getting at there.
And we just signed a partnership deal and we'd like to white label the whole app. How hard would that be?
Right. Now we have to update 3 things instead of 430 things.
Yeah, those are the very quantitative metrics you could use. I wonder if there's even qualitative, like, how fun is it for designers to design using the design system? Does it remove roadblocks so that they can actually play around with stuff that they want to and not worry about the very minute details? Although some people like doing that too. But being able to innovate, I think your best chance of success from that is removing all the mundane stuff that you've done a lot in, you know, other jobs and other systems and other design teams. So if you can remove those roadblocks out of designers' way, I think, you know, that's where they excel, where they can get in and actually start solving these higher level problems and not worry about, in particular, what UI widget is being displayed on page at that time.
Yeah, and piggyback off of what they're saying, I think there's ways to quantify it, but it's also can be skewed and challenging. Because even if you looked back and looked at progress and efficiency, even if you were using Jira or Pivotal and you're checking velocity and points and how many points were done during the last 3 months versus post-design system, the issue you will have is that all those stories were estimated pre-design system with the sense that they had to build all that stuff new. And then post, they probably have lower estimates, and because then now they don't have to deal with that task, they can focus on the other tasks. So I think there's some skewing there, and but like in general, I think it will boil down to if you want to try to quantify it, 3 months before the design system, what actually got produced and shipped. 3 months after, you know, same thing. Again, no project, 2 projects are the same, but that's a rough way to try to quantify it. I liked how you were talking about, you know, qualitative metrics here, where I think you can actually, this is where people come into play here, not just numbers and stats. And the collaboration between designers, developers, not just between them, but between each other, and also, you know, going up to product managers, product owners, the whole team, the streamlined process that it will create, it will make everyone happier. It'll appear faster. It is more exciting because people can actually get to the task at hand versus, you know, trying to come up with the pieces and the ingredients to make that solution. You know, what I like is just the design system is there for a lot of reasons, but the primary reason is so your designers can design and your engineers can develop. And they can do, you know, so like, and when I say that, I mean, yeah, designing a button is design, designing, you know, defining the corner radius or the typography, that's design. But when we're talking about UX as well, you're designing a problem for some experience, and it's a lot more complex than just this atomic component. So being able to focus and allow you your resources to do that task versus these tasks to allow them to do that, I think is the crucial metric right there.
Cool, thanks guys. So I want to make sure that we get some questions answered from you guys as well. I hope you guys have some. If you do, we do not have microphones floating around, so there's going to be a little bit of yelling going on, but I'll do my best to repeat those. Oh, yeah, and drinks are coming out, I guess, it sounds like. Sure, yeah, that'd be great. If you got one of these over here.
Exercise, execute something today.
Yep.
Anyone have a question?
First, thanks for coming, guys. That was really useful information. I work for a smaller company, like a little over 100 people, and so our needs are obviously different than a lot of the companies that you represent. But I'm curious in terms of design systems, what you see as valuable for smaller companies and what you might advise a company like mine that just has a couple designers to maybe do differently to get the most value out of it.
I think I would say there's still value in shared principles. There's still value in getting on the same page in terms of using the same UI components, agreeing on the same UI components. The answer might not be to build a unique web application that, you know, is in React, Angular, and vanilla JavaScript and does all these things. It might be they use the same UI kit and they agree on what the stacked rank principles are, and they start holding themselves accountable to that thing. Therefore, the engineers are given less inconsistent things or less unique things.
Yeah, I'd say it's also, I think those smaller companies have opportunities for those more grassroots organic creations of this. It might be challenging at your company, I don't know, to get approval for this from stakeholders, to make it a formal effort. And I think that's just where some of those team members can take some self-initiative and motivation to just move forward. And it's not an overnight thing. You're not going to build an entire system overnight or 1 week. It's, as he mentioned the ingredients earlier, you can start with those. Like even just having your color palette and typography defined, and the taxonomy and hierarchy of that, like that's a great start. The UI kit, especially, is extra bonus, philosophies, all that principles, that can come down the road. But I think you can start small. But you'll start seeing the value and consistency and efficiencies like very soon.
I also think that we talked a lot about creating a design system. Like depending on what your problems are, it might be perfectly acceptable to say, we're going to use material. We're going to use Angular material. That solves our problem. And from a design perspective, that makes a lot of design work. A lot of it is done for you. You don't necessarily have to start from scratch. To create a shiny unicorn for every single component from scratch. So I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to come away with too.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo that. I think that the smaller the company, you know, especially like as a startup, you know, like let's say you're 10 people or something like that. I mean, I think it's totally acceptable to use something like Bootstrap, right? This is like a well-tested system. It works, you know, in every version of Internet Explorer. It's accessible. Of course, like they're Lego parts, so you have to figure out how to put them together, which, you know, is something that you would get with a more mature design system. But it does allow you to move really, really fast. And so I think there's nothing wrong with that, and there's no shame in that.
Yeah, it's not even about the size of companies. Sometimes it's just resources are thin, even if they're not thin for other business units. At Time Warner Cable, we had a design team of 10 for a very, very, very large corporation. So we didn't have the resources to do it either. So you start small, and it's kind of a, if you build it, they will come. If you build something cool, you'll show the value in it, and maybe you'll get some dedicated resources.
One more note on the funding thing. If you are a larger company and your CTO comes to you and says, should we just use Bootstrap, or should we build this really complex, unique thing? If you build the thing, it's a unique capital asset, and that is very important for her.
Just do a little running here.
Thanks. Hey, I'm Lauren. I'm the design lead at Guild Education. Our design system's about 11 months old. We don't have any full-time employees on it. I would say the biggest problem we have is documentation. We have like buy-in from our wonderful engineers. But yeah, we like put in a bunch of components, but then sometimes people don't even know that it's there. So what processes do you have in place to help with that?
Well, I think the most important thing for documentation, or at least goal for documentation in my mind, you should document just enough so that someone will build it or use it correctly. I have yet to be successful at that because they never build it right the first time. The process is for letting people know new things are out there. That one I don't have a good answer for yet. We're struggling with it as well.
I think similarly to when should you write tests for the thing that you're building, I think if you do at least write light documentation when you design the component or you get the component approved, that helps a lot with the when do I write, or when should I go and document this thing. Documenting the pattern is also different, or documenting the component is also different than documenting the pattern and the context and things like that. Even if the documentation exists, to the point about notifying, it came up just today when we were designing something and it was like, oh, well, we should create a rule for when to use the background underline link versus the non-background underline link. Yeah, we should do that. Go back to my desk, literally go to the design system page, click on the links, and it's already there. And like I probably looked at it at least as frequently as everybody else has looked at it, and I didn't even think to go to the page to see what the rule is before saying, why are we doing this differently? What is the rule for this? And should we create a rule? And oh yeah, we should create a rule. So I think just having a document doesn't solve the problem of people using it wrong or not knowing how to use it.
Is the main challenge awareness? Right.
I think also doing like regular show and tells and like regular training is not the right word, but like we've done a couple of workshops because it's not implemented everywhere, and people aren't necessarily, it's relatively new to everybody, and those have been helpful. I think we haven't done them frequently enough. The office hours, the like, hey, let me sit down and work with you to build this thing that you're building, or let me talk through some of the decisions that we made and why we made them, and yes, I don't like them either.
And I think that there's also things you can do, like a lightweight newsletter, once a week or every 2 weeks, that sort of show the changes in a sort of a design-friendly manner. There's also wacky things you can do, like we had 2 different floors that were it was basically all designers and PMs and some of the front end teams. So all the people that are working with the design system itself, and we just printed out big posters every few weeks with things that we thought they should know about, like when do I use a drop down versus a list on like a 4-foot by 8-foot poster.
Awesome, thanks guys. I worked at Citrix for about 6 years or so and worked on a pattern library that we had there and basically evolved into a design system. And we had about 20 products to work with. So it was a huge suite, everything from all the go-to products, GoToMeeting, GoToMyPC, all the way up to NetScaler and Zen Desktop and all the virtualization stuff. So anyways, long story short, one of the things we ended up having to do was to be very selective with what we included in the library and in the system, because to your point, you look it up, what's the rule for this when we do this? It quickly was completely unmaintainable. And so what we did is we focused on the 80-20. Basically, we called it the thread. Like what are the key things that have to be in place across these products, and kind of let everything else go. So typography, certain color systems and palettes, UI icons, product icons. As long as those matched, we felt the family resemblance was there, basically. And just let everything else go. and told the designers to bring it back to us and say, hey, if you need guidance in this area, let us know. And maybe we'll add it, maybe we won't. So to that point, my question is there stuff you guys have specifically just excluded from the system and said, use your own discretion or let us know or whatever. So kind of what's that 80-20? What things are critical? What things have you left out?
Not yet. Right now, everything's the inverse. Everything's out, very few things are in. So I think when just establishing it, that's sort of where we are now.
I know that with Salesforce, we started out with this idea that we wanted to include JavaScript. I mean, this maybe isn't exactly what you're looking for, but we started out with this idea that we wanted to include JavaScript and like all these different forms of JavaScript, along with, to build this full interactive sort of menu of things that you can choose from. And ultimately, they pulled back from that and just created sort of a vanilla HTML and CSS output so that you can wrap it in whatever framework that you want to. So that's definitely something that they pulled out just to simplify things. I'm sure there's many other examples.
Yeah, I think the 80-20 split happens pretty naturally. Like I said, like if you get those basic things, those handle a lot of use cases. And once you get kind of centered around that, then you can keep stuff out if you want, or like have the discussions about putting new things in that are a little bit more specific and complex.
Yeah, and I also think it's almost impossible to have a solution for every scenario out there, and especially if you're dealing with different tech stacks, different products within one platform or across different platforms. I liked what you said around the family, right? Like, I think as designers, we do get kind of really tight control over a lot of things, and it's hard to let go and be flexible sometimes. But I think you need to look at the overall big picture that, does this seem to relate to the family? Is it still have the integrity of the brand, of the product? And it's not necessarily compromising. It's actually accepting and adopting that this might be a better solution that just didn't exist before. And we'll live with it now, and if it has another use case in the future, we'll add it. If not, then it's out there.
So we got time for one more question because we do have beer to drink and we all want to hang out. So make sure we get that in.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I was wondering, how many of y'all have ever think that you could put your design system into like some kind of CMS so that people can rapidly like prototype with it, or it gets I don't know, some of the best uses of Bootstrap have always been like a WordPress theme that used Bootstrap, or a material theme on, but it like just made it so easy to build things, especially on websites and stuff. Do y'all ever think that you would do that for your design system?
So we did do that at, OnDeck because we made a decision to pull, like, that the design system should also affect the marketing sort of websites and applications, et cetera, which happened to run on WordPress. So we built the components so that then they could be referenced by a page builder plugin, and that also allowed to sort of preview sort of the components coming together, et cetera. It's kind of gross, but it worked.
Yeah, I think Ryan mentioned that trying to get designers to design in the browser didn't work. But I know Airbnb's doing a lot of stuff too, where the components are actually developed first in a way, and then the designers use the actual React components in their sketch libraries. So that's kind of reducing the gap between design and development, or kind of like what you were asking about, like designing in code with a CMS instead of in Photoshop or Sketch.
All right. Thank you guys again so much for coming out, answering questions. And thank you guys so much for coming out and listening to us. It was really great. Please grab some beer, hang out. Don't leave it undrank. That would be a bummer. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming. Really exciting to see this great group of people. The last thing I'll say is if you're looking for a new place to build your career, continue to add skills, I can tell you that Spectrum is adding people to their workforce. So I can tell you that as someone who helps with them and someone who knows a lot about their culture. It's a great team to join. So if I were you and you're looking to make a move, I'd check them out.